Anybody remember when you went to school, maybe way back, or if you're a teacher, you know this, when you were real young, they did a little thing, it was always a favorite, called show and tell. Does anybody remember show and tell? When you would do show and tell, the whole concept is that you would bring something into the class to show, and as you were showing it, then you would tell about it. And as you were telling about it, maybe that thing that you brought in to show had something that was very meaningful to you. There was something about that thing that you were showing off that you were teaching people about or was special to you. I remember before I became a youth minister, I was actually going to college to be a school teacher. I wanted to teach, I wanted to coach. And so I actually did a year of student teaching. And while I was doing student teaching, as a 5th grade teacher, I was teaching on history, and I loved history. I decided to bring in something to show the class as I was telling it. So what I did is we were talking about the colonial settlement times and how they were very self-sustaining, and they came up with all these creative ways of doing things. And one of the things that I was talking to them about is the water wheel, and how the water would run down, cause the wheel to spin, which would cause a crank to turn, which would cause basically concrete or something very heavy to take this hardened corn and grind it up into this grist. And so I was at the Cades Cove water mill, and I picked up a bag of corn that had been ground up and was basically this powder substance. And so I thought, you know what, I'm not just going to tell them about it, I'm going to show it to them. So I had this baggie full of this corn grist mill, and I passed it around. And everybody, I said, you know, touch it, look at it, feel it, smell it. I mean, really imagine this was hard kernels of corn, and now feel it. And so they passed it around the class. And this girl raises her hand, and she says, Mr. White. Now in Kentucky, where I was at, the name White really has 1 syllable, but in Kentucky there, it was 2 syllables. It was always Mr. White. And so she raised her hand. I'm like, yeah, what is it? She goes, do you know what that smells like? That smells like my mama's breast milk, don't you think? So my teacher, Mrs. Martin, who was sitting there in the class, looked down over her glasses and said, well, Mr. White? Show and tell was over at that moment. At that moment, we're like, hey, who wants to go to recess? Hey, yeah, come on. That was one of those times where I was so glad show and tell was over. But here's the whole point of that story. When it comes to the church, we have gotten to the point where we're really good at telling people stuff. We're just not so hot at showing people stuff. We're really good at telling. We're just lousy at showing. And the world is watching. They're watching us. And all they hear is a lot of talk, but they don't see a lot of showing. They don't see it. And the problem is there's sometimes what we show has no resemblance to what we tell.